I just want to take a quick second as we start today to warmly welcome you to this deep dive. And before we get into the main topic, I really want to offer a sincere divine blessing over your day and this entire week ahead.
Yes, absolutely.
May your week be filled with profound peace, completely clear communication, and just abundant grace. That is my hope for you. Because today, well, we are unpacking a fascinating piece of history that shows us exactly what happens when peace and communication totally break down.
Right. It's a prime example of how quickly things can just go completely sideways.
Exactly. Usually when a massive, multi-year, absolutely grueling project finally crosses the finish line, there's a very predictable script. You shake hands, distribute the rewards, everyone tells a few war stories, and you go home happy.
Yeah, it's a moment of immense relief. The tension is supposed to just dissolve.
Yeah.
You finally get to breathe.
Right, you breathe out. But imagine you finish this monumental task, and in this case, a literal military conquest. Everyone is packing up their gear to head back to their families after years away on the front lines, and suddenly, out of nowhere, you are on the brink of a complete internal collapse.
Total civil war.
Yeah, a total civil war.
A misunderstanding so severe that the victory celebrations instantly turn into a mobilization for the total destruction of your own allies.
Ugh, it is wild. So today's deep dive is taking us straight into the heart of this ancient crisis. We are relying on some fantastic detailed study notes from the Holman and NWA's study Bibles to really unpack the events of Joshua chapter 22.
It's such a rich text.
It really is. It is a story about a massive misunderstanding that nearly triggered a catastrophic civil war in ancient Israel. And the most incredible part, it was all over a pile of rocks.
Which, I mean, it sounds absurd on the surface, right? But when you peel back the layers, it's this profound look into human psychology, trauma, and the extreme lengths people will go to in order to preserve their community.
So, to set the stage for you, we are at the very end of the conquest of Canaan. The Transjordan tribes, that's the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, have just spent years fighting alongside their brothers.
Right, they left their own families behind.
Exactly, left them behind to help conquer the land on the west side of the Jordan River. And now, finally, the fighting is done. They are getting their honorable discharge. They have permission to go back home to the east side of the river, to the lands that Moses had originally promised them.
And their commander, Joshua, gives them an incredibly warm send-off. I mean, he publicly commends them for their absolute obedience.
It's a big deal.
It is. He praises them because they didn't abandon their brothers. They stuck it out until the entire mission was complete. They followed the commands of Moses, and they followed Joshua's commands perfectly.
It's a really moving commendation. But Joshua does give them one strict condition as they leave. It's essentially, well, the golden rule of the Exodus.
Right. He tells them that as they return to their daily lives, they must exercise the utmost care to keep the commandment and the law.
Which means what exactly in practice?
Specifically, they must love the Lord their God, walk in all his ways, keep his commandments, hold fast to him, and serve him with all their heart and all their soul.
Wow.
Yeah, that specific phrasing, with all your heart and with all your soul, is a major recurring theme in ancient Hebrew texts. It represents total, uncompromising devotion.
Total devotion.
And in return for this incredible service, they aren't just going home with a pat on the back and a nice speech. They're going home incredibly wealthy.
Oh, massively wealthy.
Joshua tells them to return to their tents with great riches. We are talking massive herds of livestock, silver, gold, bronze, iron, and a huge amount of clothing. These are the spoils of war.
Yeah.
And Joshua explicitly commands them to divide these spoils with their brothers who stayed behind to guard their home territory.
Which, that was standard practice in the ancient Near East. The spoils of victory were considered gifts from the divine.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, they were meant to be shared with the whole community, ensuring that the people guarding the home front were provided for just as much as the vanguard on the front lines.
I love that detail. It's like soldiers returning home from a long, successful deployment, and they are bringing a massive war treasury back with them to completely stimulate their local economy.
That's a great way to look at it.
Everyone is happy. Everyone is rich. Everyone is praised for their loyalty. The mission was a total success. So how does this immediately go completely off the rails?
Well, it all starts on the journey home. The narrative follows these eastern tribes as they march back, and they arrive at the borders of the Jordan River, which is still technically in the land of Canaan.
Okay.
And right before they cross over to their own land, they decide to build an altar.
Okay, let's unpack this, because To a modern listener, building an altar sounds like, I don't know, a nice religious thing to do, maybe a little roadside shrine to say thanks for the safe trip, God.
Right.
But the reaction from
Yeah.
the other tribes is absolutely unhinged.
To understand the reaction, you really have to understand the altar itself. If you look at the original Hebrew text, this wasn't just a small pile of rocks that a few guys stacked up in an afternoon.
Okay, so it wasn't a little shrine.
No, not at all. The language implies it was large and visually impressive. It was a great sight, meant to be seen from far away. It was monumental.
And as soon as the Western tribes, the rest of the Israelites, hear that this massive altar has been built on the frontier, they don't send a polite letter asking what's going on.
Definitely not.
The text says the whole congregation of Israel immediately gathers at Shiloh and mobilizes their entire army to go to war against their own brothers.
And the detail about gathering at Shiloh is crucial here. Shiloh was where the legitimate tabernacle, the true authorized altar of the Lord, was located.
See, this is where I just get totally bewildered.
Yeah.
Why jump straight to a full-scale military invasion over some stones?
It seems like a leap, doesn't it?
It really does. Isn't that like your neighbor building an ugly, unauthorized gazebo in their backyard, and instead of calling the HOA to issue a fine, you call in an airstrike to level their entire property?
That is quite the visual.
It just seems like an incredibly extreme overreaction.
It does seem extreme until you dig into the specific historical and theological context that drives this reaction. The Western tribes don't just march blindly. They do send a diplomatic delegation first.
Okay, well, that's somewhat reasonable.
Right. They send 10 chiefs representing each tribe, and they are led by a man named Phineas.
Wait, they send a priest to negotiate? That feels like sending a chaplain to defuse a nuclear bomb.
I mean, I see why you'd say that.
If you are mobilizing the entire army, shouldn't you send a 4-star general to lead the parley?
In a modern context, sure. But remember, this is a theocracy. In ancient Israel, an unauthorized altar isn't a military threat. It's a divine threat.
Oh, wow, okay.
A priest actually is the top brass for this kind of existential crisis. And Phineas is not just some random bureaucrat in a robe. He has a very intense, very violent resume when it comes to defending the faith.
Right, I was reading about his background in the study notes. He previously stopped a horrific plague during an event known as the Iniquity of Peor.
Exactly. Years earlier, the Israelites had sinned deeply by getting involved with Midianite women and worshiping the false god Baal of Peor.
Which did not end well.
No, it did not. God's wrath was burning against Israel, and a devastating plague was actively wiping them out. It was Phineas who took incredibly decisive, zealous, and lethal action to execute the primary offenders.
And that stopped it.
Yes, his actions stopped the plague in its tracks.
So Phineas knows firsthand what happens when Israel commits idolatry. He has literal trauma from watching his own people die by the thousands from a plague, all because a rogue faction decided to rebel.
Precisely. So when Phineas confronts the eastern tribes at the Jordan River, he doesn't just ask, hey, what's up with the architecture? He immediately brings up two specific historical traumas.
Which ones?
He brings up the sin of Peor, which we just mentioned, saying they still haven't fully cleansed themselves from it. And then he brings up the sin of Achan.
Achan, okay, this is the guy who, during the Battle of Jericho, secretly stole some of the devoted plunder, the things that were strictly supposed to be destroyed or given to God, right?
That's the one. He hid the treasure in his tent.
And because of that one guy's secret sin, the entire Israelite army suffered a humiliating defeat at their next battle at Ai. Innocent soldiers died because of what Achan did in secret.
And that brings us to the core motivation for the Western tribes' outrage. It is the ancient Near Eastern theological concept of corporate solidarity, or collective guilt.
I really want to pause on this concept because to a modern listener, raised in a highly individualized culture, it feels incredibly unfair.
It really clashes with our worldview.
Right. I get that Achan messed up, but why punish the whole army?
Because in the ancient Near Eastern mindset, there's no such thing as rugged individualism. The nation was viewed as being bound together by a covenant with God. They operated as a single organism.
Like a body.
Exactly. The covenant blessings were corporate, but so were the curses. The Western tribes genuinely believed that if Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh were rebelling against God by building a rival altar to offer unauthorized sacrifices, God's wrath wouldn't just fall on the east side of the river.
It would fall on everyone.
Everyone. Phineas explicitly says, if you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow, he'll be angry with the whole congregation of Israel.
So it wasn't bloodlust, it was an existential panic for their own survival.
That's exactly what it was.
It's like the absolute worst version of a dreaded group project in school, where one person decides to completely slack off or cheat, and because of their selfish actions, the entire team fails the class.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Except here, failing the class means divine destruction. The Western tribes felt like their physical lives were tied to the Eastern tribes' obedience. They couldn't afford for them to fail the project.
That's a perfect analogy. And to prove that they aren't just looking for an excuse to fight, the Western tribes offer a massive, almost unthinkable concession.
What do they offer?
Phineas tells them, look, if you think your land on the other side of the river is somehow unclean because the tabernacle isn't physically located there, then come back over.
Wait, really?
Yeah. He says, we will share our land with you. We will give up our own property and inheritance to make room for you. Just please don't rebel by building a second altar.
That is wild. They were willing to literally give up their own real estate, their own farms, just to keep everyone in line under one altar.
It was that serious.
That shows you how utterly terrified they were of collective guilt. But here's why it gets really interesting. Because the Eastern tribes have been standing there listening to this whole accusation, this threat of war, and they finally get to speak.
The biblical narrative does something brilliant here. Up until this exact moment, the reader actually has no idea why the Eastern tribes built the altar.
Oh, that's true.
The text just says they built it and then shifts to the outrage of the West. The suspense builds. You are kept in the dark, feeling the same tension and suspicion as Phineas, till the Eastern tribes finally launch into their defense.
And their defense is incredibly passionate. They are horrified by the accusation. They start invoking the most powerful names of God.
Right, they're desperate to be understood.
They cry out, "The Mighty One, God the Lord. The Mighty One, God the Lord, He knows, and let Israel itself know." They are swearing on their lives that this is absolutely not an act of rebellion.
They state very clearly that they have absolutely zero intention of ever offering burnt offerings, grain offerings, or peace sacrifices on this new altar.
None at all.
If they do, they invite the Lord himself to require it of them, basically asking God to strike them down on the spot if they are lying.
Which brings up the obvious question. If it's not for sacrifices, well, why on earth build a massive, visually impressive altar that looks exactly like the one at Shiloh?
Because of the Jordan River.
The geography.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Eastern tribes reveal their own deep-seated trauma and fear, and it has nothing to do with rebellion. They weren't trying to separate from the nation. They were utterly terrified of being forgotten by it.
That is so poignant.
They looked at the Jordan River, this massive natural boundary, dividing their lands from the rest of Israel, and they worried about the future.
They lay out this whole hypothetical scenario that was literally keeping them awake at night. They say, we were worried that tomorrow, in the next generation, your children are going to look across the river at our children and say, what do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel?
It was a very real fear.
They thought they would hear, the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you. You have no share in the Lord.
They feared that a geographical barrier would eventually become an ideological and spiritual barrier.
It makes so much sense. It's like when a company shifts to remote work or you're in a long-distance relationship, at first you still feel deeply connected. But over time, the physical gap creates a cultural gap.
The shared experiences stop happening.
Right. And eventually you start to feel like you don't even belong to the same group anymore. The Eastern tribes were terrified of that decay. They were afraid their descendants would be completely cut off from the national identity and the worship of God.
Exactly. So the altar was never meant to be functional. It was an architectural replica, a literal scale model of the Lord's altar at Shiloh.
It was a massive, unmissable visual PR campaign for future generations.
It really was.
It was physical proof to say, look, we have the exact same blueprint, we worship the exact same God, we belong to you. It's incredibly, tragically ironic.
How so?
The Western tribes thought the altar was a declaration of independence, but the Eastern tribes built it as a desperate plea for permanent unity.
And when Phineas and the chiefs of the congregation hear this explanation, the relief is palpable. The text notes that it pleased them.
I bet they were relieved.
Phineas, the same guy who executed people during the plague of Peor, recognizes that this wasn't an act of treachery. It was an act of profound loyalty.
That's a massive shift in perspective.
He declares, "Today we know that the Lord is among us, because you have not committed this treachery." The crisis is instantly averted.
They pack up the swords, cancel the airstrike, and go home happy. And the eastern tribes name the altar witness, or Ed in Hebrew. It stands as a permanent witness between them that the Lord is God.
You know, the fact that they built a giant structure out of rocks to solve a communication issue tells us something fascinating about ancient human psychology.
What's that?
They didn't draft a treaty or write a scroll. They built a physical monument in the dirt. And if you look at the wider landscape of ancient Israel, this was actually their primary method of record keeping.
Because human memory is notoriously terrible. We forget things incredibly fast, especially across generations.
We really do.
The fragility of oral tradition is real. If you don't have something anchoring the story drifts.
Precisely. Ancient cultures didn't have the luxury of digital archives, cloud storage, or easily accessible mass-produced books. How do you ensure your great-great-grandchildren know who they are and what they believe?
You use the physical landscape as a hard drive. You build massive, strange physical anchors.
I love that phrase, physical hard drives.
And I know this altar of witness is just one of several of these stone hard drives placed throughout the region, right?
It is. In fact, if you look at the historical records from this era of the conquest, you can identify at least 7 major stone monuments in the land, each curating a specific piece of the national memory.
Oh, wow. What are some of the others?
Well, for instance, you have the stones at Gilgal. They were set up right after the Israelites miraculously crossed the Jordan River into Canaan, designed specifically to remember God's faithfulness in parting the waters.
And then you have monuments for much darker reasons, right? Like the massive pile of rocks raised over Achan, the guy whose sin caused the defeat at Ai.
Exactly. That was a permanent, terrifying warning about the cost of rebellion.
Contrast that with the monument raised over the king of Ai shortly after. That second monument represents a second chance and restoration for Israel after they repented and finally took the city.
They're placing their failures and their redemptions side by side in the geography.
There's also an altar on Mount Ebal where Joshua literally inscribed a copy of the law on the stones for public instruction. It was like a giant stone billboard of the law.
And you have the monument in Gibeon, remembering God's gracious action toward the Gibeonites. And finally, the great stone at Shechem, set up under an oak tree, to remember the specific day the entire nation renewed their covenant to serve the Lord.
When you lay it all out like that, you realize they are deliberately curating a tangible history. They are ensuring that a father walking with his son down a dirt road can point to a massive, unusual pile of rocks and wait for the kid to ask, hey, what's that?
And the father can say, let me tell you what that means. Let me tell you who we are.
It was how they preserved unity, taught theology, and maintained their identity in an incredibly chaotic world. The altar of witness fits perfectly into this paradigm.
It really does. It wasn't about blood sacrifice at all. It was about memory.
Yeah.
It was an anchor point to prove they were part of the story.
So what does this all mean for us today? Obviously, we aren't building giant stone altars on riverbanks to prevent civil wars with our neighbors, but the underlying dynamic of this story is incredibly relevant.
I completely agree.
Think about it. This entire near disaster, this almost bloodbath, was completely diffused by a single, honest conversation.
It's a stark, almost frightening reminder of the danger of assumptions. The Western tribes saw an action building a large altar and immediately mapped their own worst fears and historical traumas onto it.
They projected all their baggage onto that altar.
They assumed rebellion because they were terrified of God's wrath. They didn't pause to ask why the Eastern tribes were doing it until they were already standing there with their swords drawn.
They judged the intent based purely on the exterior action. And, how often do we do exactly that?
Far too often.
We see someone do something that looks like an affront, something that triggers our own insecurities or our past traumas, and we immediately mobilize for war in our own relationships, our workplaces, or our families. We draft the angry nuclear email. We cut off contact. We assume they are out to get us.
It raises a really challenging question for everyone listening. Think about the Jordan rivers in your own life.
The boundaries.
Yes. The geographical, ideological, or social boundaries that exist between you and other people. Are those boundaries causing you to assume the absolute worst about the people on the other side? When they build something you don't understand, do you automatically assume treachery?
That is such a powerful thought. Instead of assuming the worst, what monuments of witness could you build to bridge that gap? What conversations can you initiate before jumping to conflict?
Because as Joshua 22 shows us, sometimes the things that look like the biggest threats to our unity are actually desperate, clumsy attempts to hold it together.
It takes real courage to send a delegation to ask why before sending an army to destroy. Phineas, despite his zealous, violent history, had the wisdom to stop and listen when the defense was presented.
And because he listened, a monument that could have marked the site of a tragic slaughter instead became a permanent symbol of peace.
A symbol of peace that lasted for generations. A massive misunderstanding solved by simply asking questions. It really is an incredible narrative.
It sure is.
Well, thank you so much for joining us as we unpacked all this ancient history and modern application today. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to say a heartfelt goodbye. May God bless you, and may God bless all the listeners, keeping you in peace and granting you the wisdom to always seek understanding first. We will catch you on the next deep dive.